Hello and welcome to a Super Bowl edition of the Showdown Breakdown. I'm Adam Levitan of Establish the Run, of course, joined by Michael Leone. You know him from the Nerding Out at Establish the Run and making his on-camera Establish the Run video debut, the man you know, the man you love from the Showdown streets. I don't know how he does it. He's dedicated his life to single game DraftKings Showdown. It is Cody Main. Cody, welcome. What's going on, buddy?
What's up, guys? How's it going? I don't know if you remember it. I was just thinking about this today, that all of this started with a Hall of Fame game slate when I cold emailed you guys. Mm-hmm. So Broncos Falcons Hall of Fame slate 2 years ago is how this all started. So since then it's been nose to the grindstone for the Showdown slates.
Preseason.
Yeah.
Team preseason, team no sex.
Right.
You guys had to think I was nuts when I emailed you about the Hall of Fame game Showdown slate, but hey, we're here.
Well, yes, we like nuts. And yeah, I mean, did you go into this thinking I really like Showdown? I want to study Showdown 6 days a week. How did you get this Showdown obsession going?
No, I was probably a lot like most people. When you see Showdown, you think you have to luck box a third string tight end to ever win, or you're going to chop with 200 people regardless of how you play. But as I started to dive into like lineup construction and macro thoughts, there's just a lot of nuance there, and a lot of people still aren't playing optimally. It's gotten better, but no, I definitely was not a Showdown guru to start with. I had no interest in Showdown, but yeah, as I've dived into it, there's still a lot of nuance, and there's still, I mean, as much as content has grown around Showdown slates, that there's still a lot of bad decision making. So I think there's still an edge.
Oh yeah, for sure. By the way, Cody has a full-time job. He has 3 kids. He has a wife who must completely hate him now because he's doing these Showdown breakdowns 3 times a week. What is your life like now, and how can your wife tolerate this Showdown obsession?
She's sick of it. I mean, she's absolutely sick of it. She said, "Is the season finally done now?" I said, "I got one more slate, and we're good." So,
but now you got Top Shots.
Oh God. Anything but I'm just glad to be back to football. So we don't have to talk about Top Shots anymore.
Yeah. This is a Top Shot free zone. Take it easy, Leone.
Let's get back to the things that matter, like Showdown. So
yeah, exactly. Okay. Showdown in general, Leone. There's a lot of people who probably don't play a lot of Showdown who want to play because they want to play DFS for the Super Bowl. I am included in there. I generally don't play much Showdown, but I do want to play for the Super Bowl. What do you think about general Showdown strategy? And let's start with DraftKings before we get to FanDuel. And I think there's nuance in the DraftKings format far beyond what there is in FanDuel for reasons that we'll talk about. But yeah, just generally for people who have been coming from Classic, what should they know about Showdown and what they need to do to find an edge?
First of all, DraftKings prices these Showdown slates extremely well. And going into the dynamics of the game that you mentioned, the captain spot, your player earns 1.5 times points, but their salary also counts 1.5 times. And as a result of that dynamic, it's not necessarily the highest scoring player in your captain spot, because if you get a cheap player as your captain, the 1.5x spot, it's going to allow you to spend at a lot more in your flex positions. That doesn't mean you should be using a cheap player in your captain spot, but I do want to just make it clear that it's a pretty nuanced game, as Cody said. I think right off the bat, if you're playing, like if you were starting with, a cash game type format, I think, the quarterbacks in cash game, their floors are so high that they're always really strong plays. I think sometimes the kickers go undervalued in a cash game format where they have a pretty decent floor and they're good salary cap relief, whereas sometimes the skill player cap relief options can get you a stone zero. Now, if you're switching up your mindset to tournaments, the position that I find that's routinely undervalued at captain are pass catchers, like elite pass catchers that can really dominate. And that's because in a single game format, if the quarterback goes off, the quarterback is quite often a top 3 scoring player on their team, but there's a good chance that a pass catcher is right with him, or one of the pass catchers exceeds him at lower salary, and then they become a more optimal captain choice.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about concentration of targets, which I think is one of the themes of this game, whereas Brady's concentration of targets is going to be extremely wide or projects to be extremely wide. One of the values of the Chiefs, and we've been talking about it all year, is how concentrated Mahomes is around Kelsey and Tyreek Hill, of course. We'll talk about that more in a second. Before we get to FanDuel, though, Cody, any general strat for people on DraftKings? What mistakes do you see people make, just generally speaking, before we get into this specific Showdown slate?
Yeah, the thing about Showdown is we don't have 10 games to worry about like we do on main slate. So you can kind of get into the weeds on projecting game script and game flow and how certain players are going to perform given a specific outcome. So that's kind of a good jumping off point. If you're hand building a few lineups, you can kind of project how you think the game's going to play and who benefits in that scenario. And while the field's gotten a lot better about correlating around their captain, there's still some things there that you can do that are underutilized in terms of how often they're successful versus how often they're used. So we'll talk about some of that, but just correlating around your captain, building a heavily correlated lineup, and then something that we'll get into later, I'm sure, but just being in large field tournaments specifically, finding ways to be unique. So it's not just about building a good lineup. You also have to build a lineup that's not duplicated a bunch. Something that we can dive into, but correlating around the captain is one of the biggest things that I still see underutilized on DraftKings.
Sure. Okay. People have commented, hey, you guys talk so much about DraftKings Showdown. You guys have this big article that Cody does. Why don't you spend as much time talking about FanDuel's one game format? There is a reason for that. I talked about it on the solo pod maybe a month ago or so. But Leone, do you want to give people a rundown on why it's just not that interesting of a game to talk about on FanDuel?
Yeah, there's two reasons. The primary reason is their MVP spot, which is kind of like the captain spot on DraftKings. It gives you a 1.5x times the score of the player, but the salary stays the same. There's no salary bump. And as a result, unlike on DraftKings, you need the highest scoring player in that MVP spot. It's, you can't get a cheaper player there that's going to afford you more salary because it doesn't matter. If a guy is in your flex, he's going to cost the same as he's going to cost in your MVP spot. And then the second reason, as I have up here, you have one less roster spot to begin with. So it's really difficult to get unique lineups, or it's more difficult at least to get unique lineups on FanDuel because the player pool for guys that you can use in the MVP spot is whittled down. On DraftKings, literally anyone could be captain depending on a game. If it's a game where 5 expensive players go nuts, you could have a cheap guy that scores 8 DraftKings points. He could be the optimal captain because he lets you fill those other guys in flex. That doesn't happen on FanDuel because you still need the raw highest scoring player in your MVP spot. There could still be balanced lineups that win, and maybe you don't have, Mahomes in a lineup if Kelsey, Tyreek Hill, Brady, Godwin, Evans all have really big games. But within those guys in your lineup, you still need the highest scoring one in your MVP spot.
Okay, enough's enough. The people want us to talk about the Super Bowl. So we are going to talk about Super Bowl now through the lens of DraftKings Showdown salaries and format. I think one guy, if we're just talking about best raw plays, we're not talking about tournament strategy or anything yet, just the best raw plays, projection versus salary. Ronald Jones is one that stuck out to me. Ronald Jones is 2,200 in game scripts where the Bucks are in the game, where they are winning the game. Ronald Jones, I think, has a pretty even share with Leonard Fournette in rushes, not in targets, but in rushes. And so, there's plenty of value there at 2,200. Now, if the Bucks fall behind big, Ronald Jones could end up with 7 carries for 28 yards, and you're in big trouble. Obviously, Cody, how do you think about some of these plays who are clearly cheap, but somewhat game script dependent? You're not going to find a lot of total bargains down there. You see Ronald Jones is priced right around Byron Pringle, who we don't think is going to play very much. I think Demarcus Robinson, you see his projection versus salary is interesting. What do you think about some of these punts as the best values?
Yeah, and specifically on Rojo, his price was slashed 80% from his salary last week. So there's pretty big overreaction to his dud in the previous 2 weeks, but he's handling 40% of the team's rushing attempts. And like you said, if the game's close, there is routes for that to grow. He could be the lead guy if the Bucks are playing from ahead. And in some of these slates, you don't necessarily need a ceiling from every player in your lineup. You need to maximize ceiling and captain, but you can get away with some median type performances from these guys that are 2,200, 2,400, just if they allow you to afford you the ability to roster the other studs in your lineup. So yeah, Rojo's one. The one thing I will say about Rojo is he projects really well, and therefore his ownership's going to get pretty high. I think so. In lineups where you don't think the Bucks are going to keep it close, I think it's okay to get away from that. Obviously, as in terms of like cash game and floor, even if they fall behind, I think he's got a decent touch ceiling or touch floor, rushing wise. So he makes sense. He makes sense in cash formats and okay to get away from in tournaments, in the sense that he's going to get up there in ownership.
Yeah, it's really hard for Ronald Jones to find a ceiling because he's just a total zero in the pass game. I believe he has one target in like his last 7 games. And so Ronald Jones, due to the finger, COVID, thigh, Leonard Fournette's emergence, I mean, they've never trusted him on pass downs anyways. So I think Ronald Jones would be a pretty easy fade for me in tournaments. I mean, like Cody said, I could see his ownership getting away from us here even higher than 26% because people want to play Mahomes, Kelsey, Tyreek, Brady, Godwin, Evans. And so in order to do that, it's like, well, I need somebody cheap. Well, Ronald Jones is cheap. Let me just play him. So I think Ronald Jones is a pretty interesting fade, at least, even though we do have him projected pretty well. And I think in certain game strips, he's going to look like a really good play at 2,200. The other one the only other cheap skill player who I think is in play is Demarcus Robinson. Leone, we've spent a lot of time looking at this because of Byron Pringle props, because of Sammy Watkins coming back at this point. Latest report is, yes, Sammy Watkins is still expected to be back. What do you think about Demarcus Robinson? We know he sucks. He's only 4.6 points. He's 1,400 though.
And we are expecting, Sammy's targets to come from Demarcus Robinson and Pringle more so than McCole Hardman. So it makes Robinson pretty shaky, and now he's on the COVID close contact list, which we think he's going to play. We've seen this throughout the season where guys on the close contact list at the very beginning of the week have time to get cleared by kickoff, and it doesn't really sound like there's any COVID issues with Kansas City. So we think he's going to play, but it just adds a little bit more uncertainty. I know Drew is telling us in our Slack that he's a little bit concerned about him not practicing this week because they have at times in the regular season really taken it easy on guys who did not practice. Now, I think with him not actually having a health concern himself and it being the Super Bowl, I'm not too concerned about that, but it is another wrinkle. But yeah, I mean, you look at the guys down here, Pringle has 1 target in 7 games that Sammy Watkins has played. Tyler Johnson is going to be really low on the pecking order with Antonio Brown back. I mean, you might not get a target out of some of these guys, whereas Demarcus Robinson, there's a good chance, even with Sammy back, that he's at least going to be on the field a decent bit, 35, 40% snap rate type of thing. So I think he's okay. He's also interesting on FanDuel, where he's the stone min over there and makes some things work, to get your Mahomes MVP and whatnot. I did want to piggyback on a point that Cody made about how ceiling, you care about it in your captain spot, certainly, but in the flex spot, sometimes it's overrated, and sometimes correlation outside of correlating with your captain, people can go a little bit overboard on you, because you have to think, this isn't like a main slate where everyone in your lineup, in order to win a GPP, needs to hit a 90th percentile outcome, because there's a chance that no one even hits a 90th percentile outcome. It's one game. All the players in the optimal winning lineup have to come from this game. So just keep that in mind. As far as Rojo goes, I still kind of like him a little bit more than you guys if he's around 26% in large field, but I could see, if you wanted to play smaller field stuff, Rojo's ownership really ballooning, at which point, Gronkowski might be a good pivot for 800 more off of him.
Oh, God. Yeah. I would note that Cameron Brate, I think, will run more routes than Rob Gronkowski in this game. But we know Tom Brady likes to look for Rob Gronkowski in the red zone. And a lot of times in these showdown slates, getting 1 touchdown from someone who's 3K is going to make a big difference. Cam Brate has a red zone role also, but you see the salaries adjusted here. As Leone said, DraftKings does a really good job pricing these showdown slates, 1,800 more to get up to Cam Brate from Rob Gronkowski. I think an interesting part of these Mahomes slates is that they can be very expensive and they can still be underpriced. So I'm curious, Cody, how do the salaries of Mahomes, Kelsey, Tyreek stack up versus previous showdown salaries? Because, man, I mean, these guys on main slates have been such great plays. What do you think about their salaries here? Are they overpriced? Are they underpriced in terms of the Chiefs' big trio?
Yeah, DraftKings really adjusted salaries not only for the Super Bowl but throughout the playoffs. So all these guys, while they seem expensive, are actually at or below their season-long showdown averages. So that really makes the slate pretty affordably priced and really allows you to actually get access to 2 or even all 3 of these guys in some lineups. It gets a little thin if you go all 3, but they're pretty appropriately priced. Collectively, they're $100 less than they were throughout primetime showdown slates on average. So DraftKings really adjusted, probably in an effort to make sure that lineup construction was a little easier. But as Leone knows, I run these ownership projections sometimes without parameters just to see where the salary shakes out in terms of weighted salary after we get ownerships. And this slate didn't even exceed 50,000, which obviously is DraftKings cap. So it's actually pretty affordably priced. And some of these guys like Fournette and Demarcus Robinson, if they get a little bit of ownership, will make that possible. But even with the Chiefs' big 3, I think it's going to be pretty easy to make lineups this week.
Right. Yeah. Talked about a little bit. You did a thread earlier this week about certain things that happen in Mahomes showdown slates. Why don't you just talk about that for a little bit, the thread that you did?
Yeah. So there's the way that I track with DraftKings, you can get all the CSVs downloaded after the slate's over with. And then we have our ownership projections and our projections. So I just merged those together, and it kind of gives me an idea of what the field's doing versus what top 1% of lineups are doing. So Leone's got one pulled up there that just shows what the people are doing with Mahomes plus Hill plus Kelce. And you would think that I posted a poll just to see where we're kind of human psychology shook out on this. And you would think that intuitively it makes sense to pair all 3 of these guys together. They're all high ceiling guys, high floor guys. They perform well collectively, but in the slates that I've tracked, the field has only done it on 13.1% of lineups compared to 28.5% of lineups that finish in the top 1%. So if you just plug that in, like if you put Hill at captain, Mahomes, and Kelce at flex, you still have 3,800 available. So it does get pretty thin, but I think like psychologically, if you're hand building a few lineups or even if you're punching things into optimizers, there's this notion that you need to build a little bit more balanced. And we've seen that when Kelce goes off or when Kelce hits a 75th percentile, it doesn't really affect Tyreek all that much. They're actually pretty positively correlated when Kelce does well. And obviously we know Mahomes is correlated with both of those guys too. So I think that's one thing that's underutilized. I think the salaries of those 3 will get people off of them as a group, but I think it's something that's kind of an edge on this slate where you can just jam the 3 Chiefs studs, especially if you think their offense rolls, and kind of find some cheaper guys to pair them with to make it possible.
I spent a bunch of time on the last 2 solo pods just talking about how even on classic slates, even on 4-game classic slates, people were not playing Mahomes, Hill, Kelce. And I just couldn't believe it. It's like, I mean, the best quarterback maybe ever with maybe the best tight end ever with arguably the most explosive wide receiver in the game. And they have these outrageous target shares also. It just, I don't know, like it just struck me as odd that the field doesn't want to do it. I guess they have sticker shock on it. I don't know if that'll be the case here, Leone, but what do you think about Mahomes doubles in showdown? We know in classic, it's been extremely, extremely profitable this year, and the field has underplayed it.
Yeah. And this is where something we've worked on and talked with Cody about too, as far as using, the sum product ownership to project, the ownership of your team. So instead of adding up all the projected ownerships, we have them here on our projections, the total ownership of Mahomes, Kelce, Hill. And it seems like that's going to be crazy high owned. But when you start pairing it with cheaper players, as long as you're not doing it with, Rojo consistently, who's expensive, you start doing it with, a Demarcus Robinson type, or, you take a chance on some of these cheaper guys. They have such low ownerships that any combination involving them, even if it's other really chalky players, is still more likely to be unique. 3 guys that are averaging around 60% ownership and a 2% owned guy, that's going to be a more unique combination than if you had 40% ownerships across the board. So, in addition to not having to be balanced overall with your salary, but also in terms of your ownership, sometimes it pays to actually not be balanced and to be a little bit more lopsided, which plays right into the Kelce, Mahomes, Hill trio being used together.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Bucs pass game for a second here. Much less concentration. Obviously, they're getting Antonio Brown back. They're using Brait and Gronk, as we already talked about. Evans and Godwin are sharing to some degree. And I think in the regular season, I tried to play Brady stacks in some spots that I liked, but I was like, man, I didn't know who to pair him with, and it gave me some level of paralyzation. Cody, what do you think is the best way to play Brady stuff on this showdown slate?
Yeah, all three of the Bucks' big three are under 21% target shares, at least since AB's joined the squad. So it's pretty evenly distributed. And if you're playing a Brady stack, at least 2 pass catchers with him seems optimal. It's tough to get away with 3, but Brady plus 2 pass catchers seems optimal. The thing is, with the field has valued Chris Godwin as the wide receiver 1 recently, and we've seen that in recent showdown slates too, that he's been more owned both in the flex and as a captain than Evans, and now he's finally priced as such. He's 8,800 versus Evans is 8,400. And Evans actually leads the team since week 9, since Antonio Brown joined the squad. He actually leads the team in target share and air yard share and end zone targets. So I
think that was related to the knee injury, and people were like, I don't want to play Mike Evans. He has this hyperextended knee, and now it's very clear he was and is healthy.
Yeah. So do you think that ownership's going to flip back a little bit towards Evans this week?
I think it'll be pretty even, but I think people were scared about the knee and no longer are.
Okay.
So looking at just the target shares from the playoff games, I think maybe it started with people being scared of the knee, but I wouldn't be surprised if people aren't kind of correctly taking in that context and looking at the Tampa Bay 3 playoff games and seeing Godwin 25% target share, Evans 19. I think Godwin's going to be higher owned still.
Yeah. Okay.
So if that's the case, I think I have Evans projected at like 5% captain ownership, and we've seen how well wide receivers perform in high total games. So I think if the Bucks do find success through the air, then you got a little bit of leverage there with Evans versus Godwin. He's cheaper. He projects similarly, and I think he's going to be a little bit less owned.
I think one important point about DraftKings is full PPR and how scoring goes. So what Leone was talking about before, why wide receivers and captain can win even when the quarterback goes off, is because 9, 10, 11 catches on DraftKings is just a huge day, a much bigger day than 350 yards passing or whatever. So I think that the Godwin and Evans captain teams are contrarian to some degree and interesting. What do you think about the Bucks pass game and how you play that, Leone?
Yeah, I did want to bring up a tweet I put out last week. One of the difficulties in projecting the Bucks is their target share by position has really kind of bounced around, not just within the individual players, which we already saw. No one on the entire season has cracked a 20% target share overall for Tampa Bay, but even by position, it seemed like, they were trending more towards receiver target share. This was heading into the NFC Championship game. But you see it bounces around, even the running back target share, week 17, it was down to 5%, it got up to 21% combined week 19. So they are difficult to project, but with that variance means that a guy like Evans or Godwin, they have an even higher ceiling probably relative to their base projection than the average receiver, because there's not only variance in terms of if they run hot on the targets they see, there's a lot of variance in that position group, how many targets they see, and then who is sort of the alpha, if there is one within that position group. So I do like taking a chance on, it looks like a really good slate to play receiver captains on both teams, but on Tampa Bay in particular. What I'm curious Cody's thoughts are, because one thing that's going to be pretty important especially if you're playing the big tournament, which of the secondary pass catchers are you going to mess around with, so to speak, as far as, Scotty Miller, Tyler Johnson, because these guys that seem like they have absolutely no fantasy value. If you're talking about building Mahomes, Kelsey Hill teams, you're going to have to round them out with someone. And especially if you want to get away from Rojo, your options are generally on these cheaper Tampa Bay pass catchers.
Yeah, I think we're all projecting quite a bit of pass attempts for both offenses, right? So I think that even if like we were expecting Antonio Brown back, Scotty Miller's somebody, he's still run a route on 23% of Mahomes dropbacks, even when Brown's been healthy, and he's the one that gets targeted deep downfield. So he's one of those guys that he's 3,400. which actually is kind of something that I'm intrigued by because it's going to keep his ownership pretty low. He's overpriced really for what he is if Antonio Brown's back. So it's going to keep ownership in check, but I think he's one of those guys that could really pay off his salary if he just happens to catch a long one. I have a little bit of interest in Gronk. His routes have actually come up. He was pretty much like a glorified left tackle against Washington. And, he was targeted once. And then his routes climbed a little bit against New Orleans. He was targeted 5 times, looked terrible. And then last week, his routes were actually at a playoff high. Was still only targeted once. So I don't know what's going on with Gronk, if his body's just failed him or what. But he's at a price now where he's $3K. And I think the field's going to kind of finally be off of him. But if he's still involved in the red zone and near the goal line, then $3K he can pay off with 3 for 30 and a touchdown. We don't actually need a meaningful performance from him to kind of sneak into optimals. Tyler Johnson's probably too thin, I think. I mean, maybe he cracks like an MME player pool, but with AB back, I mean, he might run just a couple routes. So I do have interest in Scotty Miller and Gronk a little bit.
Yeah, I think Scotty Miller gives the Bucs something that the other 3 guys don't. And so I think Scotty Miller's role is more secure than Tyler Johnson's. In other words, Scotty Miller can run these vertical routes that I don't think that Evans and Godwin, like speed vertical routes. And I think Scotty Miller gives them a different edge. So yeah, I think they will have plays in the playbook in this game for Scotty Miller, maybe only one of them, or maybe only 2 of them, but at least it's something at 3,400. And yeah, the points on Gronk are well taken, like in a vacuum. Undoubtedly, as you see from our projection, Gronk is a better play than Scotty Miller if you're looking to punt it off down there. The running back games on both sides are convoluted. We already spent some time on the Rojo thing. I mean, Leonard Fournette, I don't think Keyshawn Vaughn or LaShawn McCoy is going to play at all in this game. And so Leonard Fournette handles all the pass down work and at least 50% of the rush down work. And so that's a really big role from Tom Brady, who throws at running backs at such a high rate. And so, yeah, Leonard Fournette is expensive, I think. But, yeah, he's very clearly a solid play, even at the price. On the other side, we don't know exactly. Clyde Edwards-Helaire started the AFC Championship game. Clyde Edwards-Helaire did not play very well. Early in the third quarter, Clyde Edwards-Helaire got lit up on a hospital ball from Mahomes and didn't get another touch the rest of the game. Darrell closed it out. Tell the people how we're projecting the CEH versus Darrell situation, and also Le'Veon Bell is expected to be back in the mix here, Leone.
Yeah, have Le'Veon Bell with a real sprinkle, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up not playing, even if he was active and just ended up not seeing any of the snaps. It's definitely a difficult situation to project. Last week by the end of the game, it ended up where we thought it was going to get, but it didn't exactly happen the way we thought it was going to get. As you mentioned, CEH started that game and just was ineffective. And then Darrell did play some passing downs. And then, towards the end of the game, whether it was health or whatever, CEH wasn't in there and Darrell was pretty productive, helping them run the clock out against the Bills. So we're projecting, kind of a similar split as it ended up last week, which is Darrell ahead. We think Darrell is going to play passing down, even if we're wrong and CEH is ahead. So I think he's the better value between the two. Right now, we have the market sort of tailing us on that and chasing, kind of where it ended up last week. So you don't really get an ownership discount on it like you did last week if you played the 2-game slate, which was nice. But that's where we're at on KC and on Tampa Bay. We have basically half a point of projection for McCoy as the third back, but all Fournette and Rojo. I do think there's a chance that if Tampa Bay gets ahead in this game, that we see more Rojo than people expect than we have seen. But 3-point dogs. I like KC to cover the -3. I don't know if we do get that game script.
Yeah. Cody, any thoughts here? Because Clyde Edwards-Helaire is so overpriced. I mean, $7K for Clyde Edwards-Helaire when we don't even know if he's going to be the starter in this game. We know he's not going to play pass downs. Any thoughts on the Chiefs running back situation?
Yeah, Leone nailed it. And piggybacking off something he said earlier in the season is when there's a projection uncertainty and the field's going to follow the more, the higher projected player, there might actually be a little bit of leverage. If we're just wrong on CH's role in this game, he's practicing in full now. Mm-hmm. We know that he was the lead back during the regular season. We know no one's going to run against Tampa Bay, but if he does happen to take over a little bit of the pass game work, then if we just happen to be wrong on his projection, he's going to be pretty low owned. And I think we've got him at 16% now. That might actually be a little bit high. So I don't know if I want to chase the Darrell Williams ownership, but if CH gets down there, he might be an interesting large field tournament type play.
Yeah, that's just where it's so tough doing the projections, because you're trying to get it, what's most likely to happen. But then when you go to play, as Cody said, it's like, well, I don't really know what's going to happen, even though I think it's going to be Darrell. If everyone's going to play that, I'm going to play CH. No one's going to play him at 1,800 more. So it's tough.
Yeah, and also, as Cody mentioned, I mean, not only do we not know, but efficiency is a major question. Bucks have the league's #1 DVOA rush defense, and teams haven't even really tried to run the ball at a very high rate against the Bucks. It's just been so dominant. On top of that, we have the Kansas City offensive line situation. I mean, just total geeks off the street right now. Second, third stringers playing offensive line for the Chiefs in this Super Bowl. And, we could see more screen game, but, it's hard for me to see the Chiefs getting a good running game going here, a pure running game. And that leads back to Darrell, because I don't think CEH will be the pure pass down back. Let's talk some lineup combos. So one of the things I think turns people off is what Cody said from the top about Showdown. Making a good lineup is one thing. It's not good enough on Showdown. You need to make a good lineup that's also unique, because if your lineup is duped 300 times, I mean, look, man, I would do inhumane things for a share of $1 million. But you're immediately slashing your EV by such a massive time every time that you're duped. And so it's hard, man. It's hard to kind of change your thinking from, I want to play the best team, I want to play a contrarian team. No. I want to play a team that is so off the wall that I'm the only one that hasn't. I think that turns some people off on Showdown, to be honest. What do you think about that in general, Cody? And how would you think about being unique on this slate without just being totally out of control?
Yeah, and that's the thing about playing a more correlated type lineup. And I know others have talked about this too, but when you're playing correlated, it's the combinations tend to be pretty obvious. You're not doing anything wild. You're pairing Captain Mahomes with 2 wide receivers, and you're trying to fill out the salary from there. And those type of lineup combinations tend to be more popular. So I think the first thing is, and there's really no way to quantify this, but the first thing people need to do is kind of throw correlation out the window a little bit, at least in the flex positions. And Leone talked about this, but just realizing that even something that's slightly negatively correlated isn't necessarily bad in Showdown, because the field probably overrates it, and it's going to be less owned as a whole. There's a few other things that are quantifiable and things you can do in lineup optimizers, or things you can kind of do off the top of your head. But if you're limiting salary, especially on a slate with Mahomes and Kelsey and Hill, if you're limiting salary, you're likely to be less duplicated. Cumulative ownership is another one. The lower that your the lower that your lineup's total ownership is, the less likely you are to be duplicated. But Leone mentioned some product, and that's the biggest one. It's really shown the highest correlation with lower duplicates. The lower some product you have in your lineup, the less likely you are to be duplicated. And that, like I said, that just means that if you have 2 players, one that's owned at 20% and one that's owned at 25%, which is 45% total ownership, is much different than having someone that's 40% and another player that's 5%. So keeping that in mind. And as you're toying with lineups and lineup optimizers, that's one thing that can really separate you. But you're right. The value in the EV is not only in being first, but the EV is in being first and solo first. Right. So you kind of have to max, you kind of have to crank your uniqueness up to 11 for these Showdown slates, especially with 650,000 entries.
Yeah. Were there a lot of solo winners this year? I wasn't really following it. Did a lot of people ship Showdown solo this year?
It was actually pretty mixed this year. There was, like I said, I think the field's getting better about correlating. And so you're seeing some of these slates that are really correlated yield some pretty heavily duplicated lineups. I mean, we saw like just a handful, I would say, less than 10. But then you've got some of these slates that are, well over 100. Ravens at Browns was over 100 duplicates. Football team at Eagles was over 100. So you kind of get a mixed bag. It just really depends on how unique the game goes.
Leone, how do you think about trying to be unique without being completely off the wall? And you can talk about the big one, but I think there's going to be people playing, the 500-man fields, the 300-man fields who are interested in your take on trying to be unique there and without being completely out of control.
Yeah. Just to add to this, some product ownership, that might sound like something that's complicated, but really, if you just multiply the ownerships of all your players together times the amount of entries in the tournament, in this one, there's 650,000, right, Cody? Something like that in the big tournament. That'll give you a very rough idea of how many other people have this lineup. So, you can do that very quickly just to see if you have too much ownership. As far as the smaller field stuff, I think people sometimes trend a little bit more towards the best projected lineup, and they get away from kind of like simulation theory and the range of outcomes where, so a guy like Mahomes might be over-owned in a smaller field tournament in the captain spot because, his base projection, of course, it's going to be higher than Kelsey and Hill. But with Kelsey and Hill, it's very unlikely that their projections are distributed in a way where they're scoring exactly the same amount. One of them's probably scoring higher, one of them's probably scoring a little bit lower. That gap's can be wider. And the one that scores higher has a really good chance of getting in that captain spot over Mahomes. And, I think that as far as like optimal captain exposure, that, Kelsey and Hill in a vacuum are just as good a captain plays as Mahomes when you consider range of outcomes and the way games go. But Mahomes is going to be twice as owned as those guys in captain and large field. I think that gap could be even wider in small field. I know talking to Colin Drew, a friend of mine who's very good at Showdown Drewby, that he's noted he thinks the field is going to play maybe Kelsey a little bit more than Hill, which also matches our ownership projections. And that leaves me really liking Tyreek Hill and Mike Evans as captain plays in smaller field tournaments. Like, you're not being stupid with either of those plays, but you're still getting pretty good leverage.
I think generally people have a question about when to play kicker and when to play defense in Showdown. You don't have to play either. You can. They are at times good salaries, good salary savers. Obviously, in this slate, defenses are not going to project well because Mahomes and Brady are both very good at avoiding interceptions, are both very good at avoiding sacks. Cody, what do you think about playing kickers and defense on this specific slate?
Yeah, the thing about kickers and defense is the field generally overrates when they think they should play them, and then underplays them when they should, when they should play them. So in high total games, I just pulled the stats on this, but in high total games, kickers landed in the top 1% of lineups on 30% at 30%, and then the defenses were at 25.6%. And they're going to be less owned, well less owned than that. I think Buckner might get up there. But the thing is, even though the slate as a whole projects to be high scoring, you can kind of get away with some of these floor performances. And then they're going to be they're priced appropriately. You can see the Bucks there at 2,600 and the Chiefs there 2,800. So they're priced appropriately, and you get these slates where defenses are priced at 7,000 or 7,500 and they're owned at 50% clip. That's not the time to play them. The time to play them is in these type of scenarios where they don't need they don't need to put up a wide receiver one type of score in order to land in the optimal lineup. So I actually like both defenses quite a bit, and both kickers from a floor perspective. But I think both defenses have a little bit of ceiling upside with the sack projection that we think we might be in line for in this game.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we talked about the Chiefs' offensive line situation, Bucks' defensive line, one of the best and most athletic in the league, and also both teams' secondaries. I mean, they have playmakers back there as well. Obviously, you're looking for a pick six if you play one of the defenses. Leone, what do you think about generally playing kickers and defense and Showdown, and what about in this spot?
Yeah, the defenses, Cody covered it pretty well. I think what happens is the low total games, the floor on the defense is a little higher, but that's misleading because it doesn't really matter that much if the floor is 23 points allowed instead of 15 points allowed. That's one fantasy point difference, and people kind of overrate that points allowed aspect. And I think part of it too is that the skill players around the defenses are obviously projecting lower in a low total game, and people gravitate towards those defenses. But in this game, they're so cheap, and we're going to see dropbacks from both of these teams. These are two teams that are very high up there in pass rate over expectation. Kansas City led the league in the metric I use this season. Tampa Bay ended up top 5, and Tampa Bay is playing in likely a more negative game script, or at least more neutral script than they have much of the year. So I like them. That's where you generate big point opportunities with lots of dropbacks. We don't really care about the points allowed too much. Obviously, if we get a game that shoots out into the 30s, you're not going to want defenses, but if we get a game that's in the 20s, the defense is very well could be there. And I like the kickers quite a bit where, 9 points, our base projection from a kicker could get it done, and the floor there, sometimes floor is underrated in MME showdown tournaments because, again, not everybody in your flex is going to hit a ceiling. So to have a cheaper player with a floor, makes some sense. So I'm higher on the kicker and defense probably than the field in this setup, which is kind of weird to say given the super high total of the game and just the fact that everyone's going to want to jam skill players left and right.
Sure. And I think there's some correlation that you can do. And I want to talk about lineup combos for a second here, but like one that immediately comes to mind for me is like Ronald Jones with Bucks D, in the event the Bucks get out to a lead, defense plays great, and you get a big Ronald Jones game. And I think you can do things like that. Mecole Hardman with Chiefs D is a double dip opportunity. Also, you could say, Dink was talking about more screen opportunities for Mecole Hardman in this game to try to get the ball out quick to avoid the pass rush of the Bucks. You also have injury concerns around Sammy Watkins and around Demarcus Robinson, who's going to miss practice this week. We do expect him to play again. But yeah, I think stuff like that, Chiefs and Mecole, stuff like that, any lineup combos, Cody, that you thought made a lot of sense in this game?
It still seems like even to this point, the field is underrating underdog heavy lineups. That's one of the things that I've done a lot of work on, is just looking at how the field is constructing lineups versus teams that are actually performing well. And so it looks like that in high total games specifically, about 4% of the field's playing these 1-5 type lineups, which just means one favorite and 5 underdogs. And then 9% of the entries that finish in the top 1% are playing this type of style. So just in terms of macro lineup construction, you can start to see these lineups that, especially as it seems like a lot of people are favoring the Chiefs covering -3. You could see this, a Bucks heavy type roster construction start to yield good results. I still think, and one of the things I've harped on in Showdown breakdowns for anyone that's read those articles throughout the year, is pairing your captain quarterback with 2 pass catchers. It seems intuitive, and we've talked about how if targets are pretty concentrated, the wide receiver is more likely to outscore the quarterback, even if the quarterback does well. But the field's still overusing like quarterback plus 1 pass catcher. So that's one combo that I'm still interested in. And then specifically for this slate, it seems like that, like I said before, the Tyreek plus Hill plus Mahomes is underutilized, and even Tyreek plus Hill or Tyreek plus Kelsey, that is without Mahomes, is a little bit underused. The pass game is so concentrated on the Chiefs side that both of those guys can kind of hit a little bit of a ceiling. And then if the salaries just don't work out where Mahomes doesn't land in the optimal, then you can kind of see that happening, and it's going to lead to a unique construction. But as a whole, we should loosen up a little bit, just because of how popular groupings can be if you're overly correlated.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Playing Hill and Kelsey without Mahomes was something that I thought was interesting, just because it's so concentrated to them and you can save money off Mahomes. That was something I thought was interesting during the regular season at times. Anyways, Leone, any combos in this slate that you find interesting, or even, what do you think about the 1-5s and the 1-5s with the underdog and the 1-5s with the Chiefs and stuff like that? Or are you mostly making more 2-4s and 3-3s?
It looks like I'll make more 2-4s and 3-3s than I usually do. Last year I had a ton of success with the 5-1s and the onslaughts, but the field has been a little bit better, as Cody alluded to, doing that, at least on the favorite side. I think what's interesting is when you think through the game script and you're wondering, okay, if KC wins, well, first of all, there's more variance than people think in who's going to win the game and how it's going to go. But even if KC wins, it could still be heavy Tampa Bay in terms of the lineup construction, because the way, again, the scoring works, where Casey gets out to a big lead, maybe it's like last time where it's heavily through one player like Tyreek Hill, who went nuts, and you get your Tyreek Hill captain game. But then Tampa Bay's throwing the entire second half, gas on the pedal. They're racking up receptions left and right. So Brady's getting there on volume. Multiple pass catchers are getting there just on catches, not necessarily touchdowns. And you start to see where, okay, Brady and 3 pass catchers is in here, even in a game where they lose by 10. So you want to think through it that way. I did look at some kind of correlation stuff and some different lineups. I think I wouldn't overthink where you use Ronald Jones. Again, it's hard because he's going to be popular, but as sort of the best cap relief playing a vacuum, you can play him with Brady, even though he's not a pass catcher, because generally if Brady's doing well, the offense is doing well, the script is a little bit better, and Rojo can get there with rush attempts, goal line attempts in the second half. Maybe he catches a ball on an early down. And similarly, if you don't want to over restrict your groups, as Cody said, so there might be some lineups with Ronald Jones and Fournette together. If we look at the projections, those guys are very negatively correlated. I'll bring it up. I ran their correlations. This is a correlation matrix. And if I look at Tampa Bay, if I look at Leonard Fournette if I bring up Ronald Jones here and look at him with Leonard Fournette, it's the biggest negative correlation on Tampa Bay. And you'd say, why would you use them together? Well, the reason is that they're combined only $10,000 and they're guaranteed a certain amount of touches. If Leonard Fournette hits our projection, Ronald Jones hits our projection, they could both very easily be in the optimal lineup. You're not needing ceiling games out of both of them. So if people overthink that one, I think they could end up grouping out some lineups that are actually very good lineups.
Yeah. Okay, before we go, just generally, Leone, on the big 650,000 entry one versus smaller field stuff, what would you tell people who say, I don't feel like messing with the lottery, but I still want to make a good lineup for the smaller field? Obviously, you're going to eliminate some of the really, really, really thin plays. Anything else? I know you said you thought wide receivers and captain were interesting in those kind of formats. Anything else for the smaller field stuff?
Yeah, I might think through it. I just was talking about how people group out the nuts sometimes in these large field tournaments. I might think through the correlation a little bit more in the smaller field tournament, because you're not trying to be perfect. And I think there's a really big difference in how you're playing Showdown. If your goal is to be perfect, which you basically have to be to win a 650,000 man field, or if your goal is to just get smart leverage and be able to win a tournament without being perfect. And the latter is sort of what you're trying to do in a small field tournament. So I would be careful of using Mahomes at captain, which is tough to say, but I think he's going to be owned, just too much at captain. I would be very heavy pass catcher in captain. And I would whittle out some of the very thin plays.
Yeah.
Because again, you're not trying to hit the nuts in a small field. So if there's a lineup that comes out, maybe in the large field, you need a $200 play to literally just round out the lineup. Like that could happen where a guy gets one catch and is in the optimal because he's the only 200 player who scored. That's not probably the type of thing you're going to do in a smaller field tournament. Because again, you don't need to be absolutely perfect.
For sure. Okay. We've said it all on Showdown. Do we miss anything? Does anybody have anything else to add on Showdown for the last time in the 2020-21 NFL season? Does anybody have anything else on Showdown? Okay. We've said it all officially. Enjoy the Super Bowl. Cody, tell the people where they can find you. Cody's been tweeting a lot of really interesting stuff about Showdown. Tell the people where they can find you, Cody.
Yep, at CMain7 on Twitter, and then I think Jackson's getting ready to post the breakdown on the site. So I hit a few nuggets in there. So check out the breakdown on the site and at CMain7 on Twitter.
Yeah, for those of you guys that aren't subscribers, Cody was writing 3 full-blown Showdown breakdowns a week: Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night, going over all the stuff that we talked about here in written form. And I think it was a big value add for people. Smash the like button. Producer Leone stepping up with the smash the like button graphic. Very impressive. Please subscribe, hit the notification bell. We'll continue throughout the offseason to bring you guys some free content here on our YouTube channel. Leone's already done best ball because he's on Team No Sex. He's already done a 28-round best ball draft for the 2021 season. The 2021 season. All right. Somebody go out there and win it. Solo win the Super Bowl Showdown. That would be an accomplishment for sure. If not, someone go out there and chop it. Good luck to everybody. Last game of the year. It's been a pleasure with you guys for the entire season. Thank you very much for all the support. For Cody, for Leone, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.